In our first instructional filming video, Austin is going to give a high-level overview of how cameras work, laying a foundation to understand terms like frame rate, resolution, and compression, and how they apply to your outdoor video.
So to get started, let's figure out a few basics about how cameras work. With digital cameras, light comes through the lens, focuses on the image sensor, and is then processed into a digital image. When you hit record, your camera takes a bunch of these images every second, so it's kind of like a flip book. The number of images the camera takes per second is called the frame rate, or frames per second. The main three frame rates are 24, 30, and 60 frames per second, and each one will give your footage a slightly different look. The truth is, your camera is probably recording in these frame rates, but we just call them 24, 30, and 60 because it's easier. So 24 frames per second is a little jittery and is mostly used for the movie industry. 30 frames per second is smoother and is used for TV since most TV channels play at 30 frames per second. With 60 frames per second, you have 60p and 60i. Just ignore 60i. 60p is used to capture a lot of fast-moving action because it's super smooth. To be honest though, most people think it looks weird for anything other than sports. 60 frames per second also reduces the amount of light in your footage and it makes bigger file sizes. But you can get basic slow motion when you slow 60 frames per second down to 30 frames per second in editing. We'll talk more about slow motion later. So for online videos, you can use any frame rate you want. But for outdoor television, 30 frames per second is pretty much the standard to record in. Also, if your camera is showing these frame rates, you need to change your settings from the European format to the North American format called NTSC. And don't worry, no matter what frame rate you used, editing software can convert footage to play at 30 frames per second for TV, but it's better to get it right before you hit record. Because video is so much information for a camera to process, it cannot process and record all of the information as fast as is coming in. So your camera uses a technique called compression. Compression is how the camera summarizes all of the information in your images. The more it compresses the information, the less you're able to change things like colors and brightness in editing. It's also important to get the correct speed SD card for your camera so you don't lose even more video quality. You'll probably have to read your manual to see what it takes. Now let's look at aspect ratio and resolution. Aspect ratio is the shape of the video. In the old days, video and TVs were more square. This was called 4:3. Now, almost everything is filmed in a wider shape called 16:9. New cameras record in 16:9 by default. So if you're using an older camera or your video is square, make sure you're not recording in 4:3. Resolution tells us how much detail a video has. Video is made up of little squares or rectangles called pixels. So the more pixels you have, then the more detail you can see in your video. The most common resolution right now is 1920 by 1080, which means your camera is recording 1920 pixels in this direction times 1080 pixels in this direction. But now that 1080's been around a while, a lot of newer cameras can record even higher resolutions like 4K. However, most TV channels still play at 1080 right now, so the big question is why would you even bother using 4K? So if you shoot a 4K video but only need a 1080 resolution, then the dimensions of your video are way bigger than they need to be, so you have a lot of extra room to crop your video or digitally zoom in before you start to lose any resolution. This can be a big help if you're a new cameraman or you're filming some fast-moving action that's hard to follow with the camera. Basically, it just gives you a lot of room for error. Also, if you shoot your footage in 4K, it's going to be relevant that much longer into the future. Alright, so if you survived that video, that one was pretty technical and they should get better from here on out. So, couple things though. One, none of that stuff is going to stop you from filming your hunt, so don't worry too much about it. The other thing is, I couldn't actually show 24 and 60 frames per second because when you mash all the videos into a final project, you have to choose a frame rate, and obviously I chose 30, so I think we're looking at cameras next, so it should be kind of interesting. Stay tuned.